The USS Freedom roared with activity, every deck buzzing with the low hum of machinery, the clatter of boots on steel, and the occasional sharp whistle of officers giving orders. The sun had barely risen, casting golden streaks across the polished metal of the warship, but already the crew was in full drill mode. Commander Jake Dalton, 38, a man whose reputation preceded him in the fleet, moved briskly across the deck, barking instructions. His voice was sharp, commanding, almost predatory, a voice that had made men sweat and women steel themselves. Dalton prided himself on discipline, precision, and results, and he demanded nothing less from anyone under his command. The crew responded with practiced obedience, though some eyes darted nervously toward him. He had earned their respect through decades of experience, but also their quiet fear. Dalton had fought in multiple deployments across volatile waters, a decorated officer with medals lining his chest. But arrogance shadowed his achievements, and it was in moments like these, during high-stress drills, that his impatience could become a problem. This morning's exercise was a simulation of hostile boarding. An imaginary enemy was attempting to breach the ship. Sailors were scrambling to positions, manning defense points, carrying out drills with an intensity that mirrored real combat. Dalton's eyes scanned the deck like a hawk, calculating, measuring, noting errors before they could even manifest. Orders flew from his mouth like bullets. Left flank. Move faster. Check your perimeter. Eyes open. Among the chaos, a new officer entered the drill area. She was unassuming at first glance, dressed in standard-issue fatigues, hair tied back, moving with quiet confidence. Her presence barely registered to the sailors at first. Dalton, however, noticed the way she stood upright, unshaken by the shouting, scanning the deck with a calm intensity that even he could not ignore. He frowned slightly. New officers weren't supposed to blend in this seamlessly. They usually hesitated, stumbled, or overcompensated with unnecessary bravado. Dalton moved toward her, sharp eyes narrowing. "What's your name, officer?" He barked, his tone carrying the edge of a man who believed no challenge could unnerve him. "Admiral Evelyn Ross, sir," she said softly, almost imperceptibly, as if testing whether he could hear the authority beneath her calm voice. She didn't raise her chin, didn't try to assert dominance. Her presence alone commanded it. Dalton blinked, assuming he had misheard. "Admiral? Here? Among a drill?" But before he could register further, the drill intensified. A simulated breach came from the port side. Dalton spun, moving quickly to intercept what he imagined as chaos, but in that split-second pivot, his elbow caught Ross squarely across the jaw. She stumbled backward, her head tilting unnaturally, and a hush fell over the deck. Dalton froze, the familiar roar of his own authority faltering as he processed what just happened. A trickle of blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. Dalton's mouth went dry. "Watch where you're going," he barked, reflexively, trying to mask his panic with anger. "This is training, not a playground." For a heartbeat, Ross remained still. Then she raised her eyes, meeting Dalton's with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "Commander Dalton," she said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "You just struck an admiral." Dalton's brain froze. The entire deck seemed to stop, as if holding its collective breath. The other officers and sailors froze mid-motion, glancing between Dalton and this woman whose quiet command now dwarfed his own. What are you talking about?" Dalton stammered, trying to recover the authority he had so effortlessly wielded seconds ago. Ross straightened, brushing her hand across her mouth. Blood smudged her fingertips, but she made no sound of complaint. "I am Admiral Evelyn Ross," she repeated, voice steady, unwavering. "And you just hit me in a training drill. Do you know the protocol for striking a superior officer?" Dalton swallowed hard. His mind raced. This was unprecedented. He had never hit a woman officer, let alone an admiral, during a drill. The implications, both bureaucratic and personal, were beginning to press down on him like the weight of the ship itself. I didn't know. He started, but the words sounded weak, hollow even to his own ears. Around him, whispers began. Sailors exchanged glances, some shocked, some barely containing amusement, others simply confused. The discipline of the deck, once a roaring machine, now carried an awkward tension. Dalton's heart pounded as he realized the enormity of his mistake. He had acted reflexively, out of habit, and now faced consequences far greater than a reprimand. Ross stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. "Commander," she said, and the single word carried the weight of 100 drills, deployments, and battles. "Your actions, intentional or not, could have caused serious harm. And yet, I see your surprise, your shock at what you've done. Perhaps this is the lesson you needed." Dalton's pride burned, a mix of shame and anger swirling inside him. He had spent years building a reputation of strength and precision, and now, one impulsive motion had undermined it entirely. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the raw authority in Ross's eyes rooted him to the spot. Finally, a senior officer approached, voice tense but controlled. "Commander Dalton," he said, "step aside. This is being handled." Dalton's knees felt weak, and his face, flushed from both exertion and embarrassment, betrayed the storm raging inside him. Ross didn't move. She simply watched, calm, unyielding. Dalton realized, in that moment, that his arrogance had blinded him. He had misjudged her entirely, her quiet strength, her unwavering control, and the immense respect she commanded, even before she spoke. He had assumed he led by fear and skill alone, but here was a woman who led by presence and intellect, qualities far more dangerous than brute authority. Ross, wiping the blood from her mouth with surprising composure, turned slightly to face the crew. "Gentlemen," she said, voice carrying across the deck, "the first lesson today is that strength without awareness is weakness. Learn it well." The crew remained silent, absorbing the gravity of the moment. Dalton, standing slightly behind her, felt a strange mix of admiration, guilt, and fear. He had thought himself untouchable, the master of this environment. Yet one moment of carelessness had humbled him in ways he had never imagined. As the deck returned to routine operations, Dalton found his thoughts unrelenting. He couldn't shake the image of Ross's steady gaze, her calm demeanor, and the subtle authority that radiated from her like heat from a forge. In that instant, he knew his career, and perhaps even his understanding of leadership, was about to be forever changed. And somewhere deep inside, a spark of curiosity ignited. Who was this woman? How had she risen through the ranks to become an admiral, respected and feared in equal measure? Dalton didn't yet know the answers, but one thing was certain. His mistake had set in motion a series of events that would challenge every assumption he had ever held about power, respect, and command. The drill continued, but Dalton no longer moved with the same confidence. His movements were cautious now, eyes flicking to Ross repeatedly. For the first time in his career, he realized that leadership wasn't about dominance, speed, or even skill alone. It was about presence, intelligence, and the ability to command respect without demanding it. And Admiral Evelyn Ross had all of that in abundance. That single blow, accidental, impulsive, reckless, had changed everything. The news of what happened on the USS Freedom traveled faster than the morning sun over the Pacific. By midday, whispers had already reached every corner of the fleet. A commander had struck an admiral in the middle of a drill, a fact that sounded absurd yet undeniable. In the mess hall, sailors murmured, exchanging glances. Some smirked, unable to hide the amusement at Dalton's rare humiliation. Others shook their heads in disbelief, muttering about what this could mean for their chain of command. Even the officers, typically disciplined and restrained, found themselves quietly speculating. Dalton, meanwhile, paced his quarters, gripping the rail of his bunk. The adrenaline from the morning drill had long since faded, replaced by the cold, heavy realization of the fallout awaiting him. His mind raced. What kind of reprimand would he face? Demotion? Suspension? Worse, public humiliation in front of the fleet? His medals, his years of service, his reputation, it all felt fragile, as if one misstep had shattered the carefully constructed edifice of his career. A sharp knock on the door jolted him. "Come in," he muttered, forcing a semblance of composure. Lieutenant Harris, a junior officer who usually delivered reports, entered cautiously. "Commander," the briefing officer just confirmed. "The Admiral has requested your presence at an immediate review." His voice was tense, the kind that made Dalton's chest tighten. "She's not pressing charges, sir, but she insists you be personally evaluated under her command before the next mission." Dalton blinked. He had expected anger, punishment, perhaps even a suspension. But this? Working directly under her? The thought was infuriating and humiliating in equal measure. His pride bristled, a wild, untamed thing he'd spent decades honing. Dalton had never answered to a female officer, especially not one who hadn't even introduced herself during the drill. And yet, this calm, unyielding presence had somehow seized control of the situation, turning his worst moment into a personal challenge. By the time Dalton arrived at the briefing room, the tension in the air was palpable. Officers hovered near the doorway, some offering polite nods, others smirking slightly. He paused, taking a breath, and stepped inside. Admiral Evelyn Ross sat behind a polished steel desk, her posture impeccable, her expression unreadable. The corner of her mouth had a faint trace of blood, now cleaned, but it did nothing to diminish the aura of authority she radiated. Dalton felt an involuntary tightening in his chest, a recognition that here, finally, was someone who didn't fear him or anyone else. "Commander Dalton," she said, her voice smooth, controlled, almost hypnotic in its calm authority. "Take a seat." Dalton hesitated, but complied, sitting opposite her. The room was quiet except for the low hum of ventilation. For a moment, neither spoke. Dalton searched for a foothold, an angle, something to assert himself, but found none. She didn't flinch, didn't react with anger or drama. It was maddening. Finally, she broke the silence. "I understand the elbow was accidental." Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, pinned him in place. "But accidents have consequences, Commander. On a ship, in combat, mistakes can cost lives. Today, your mistake was personal. Tomorrow, it could be catastrophic." Dalton's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to defend his reflexive action, but words felt inadequate. He had been trained for battle, for strategy, for decisive action, but nothing had prepared him for facing an officer who commanded respect without intimidation, whose presence alone could cut through arrogance like a blade. Ross leaned forward slightly. "I am not here to destroy you, Commander. I am here to test you, to see if you can lead without ego, without reliance on fear. You will work under my supervision for the next mission. Fail, and the Navy will decide your fate." Dalton swallowed hard. Pride warred with reality. His instincts screamed to resist, to assert himself, but something deep inside told him this was a challenge unlike any other. She wasn't asking for obedience, she was demanding transformation. Over the next several days, Dalton experienced the subtle but relentless pressure of Ross's supervision. Every decision he made was observed. Every instruction he gave, every order he barked, every command he issued was analyzed with quiet precision. Ross did not yell. She did not humiliate. She corrected, guided, and exposed weaknesses with a surgeon's precision, highlighting errors in judgment, lapses in strategy, and moments of overconfidence. Dalton found himself constantly on edge, second-guessing his own instincts. But it wasn't just about mistakes. Ross rewarded initiative, praised clear thinking, and acknowledged creativity under pressure. Slowly, Dalton realized this was not punishment. This was education. Her methods were relentless, yes, but fair. He began to see cracks in his own arrogance, moments when his pride had blinded him to danger, to nuance, to the strengths of others around him. The crew watched these interactions with fascination. Some whispered, questioning Dalton's ability to handle the pressure. Others began to respect him, not for his old bravado, but for the humility he was beginning to display. And through it all, Ross remained unshaken, a steady force amid the undercurrents of tension and gossip. Dalton found himself reflecting on her past as well. Word had it she had risen through the ranks in an environment that often resisted her presence. She had faced prejudice, skepticism, and outright hostility. And yet here she was, an admiral commanding respect, quietly dismantling his arrogance without raising her voice. Dalton's respect for her grew, tinged with awe, though he would never admit it aloud. The turning point came during a routine drill. Dalton had been about to give an order that would have exposed the crew to unnecessary risk. Ross intercepted him quietly. "Stop," she said, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Think before you command. Fear is not leadership. Calculation is." Dalton froze, feeling the weight of her hand and the truth of her words. He realized that all his life he had equated strength with dominance, fear, and action. Ross taught him that real leadership was quiet, deliberate, and guided by responsibility, not ego. By the end of the week, the dynamic between them had shifted. Dalton was still the same commander in rank and title, but the arrogance that had once defined him had begun to ebb. He moved with more caution, listened more attentively, and sought advice rather than issuing unchecked orders. The crew noticed, admiration replacing whispers of ridicule. One evening, Dalton sat alone on the deck, staring at the horizon where the sky met the ocean in a seamless line of gold and blue. He thought about the elbow, the humiliation, the words of Ross, and the lessons he was beginning to understand. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, a mirror of the vastness of what he still had to learn. And in that quiet moment, Dalton made an unspoken promise to himself, to Ross, to the Navy, that he would not squander this second chance. One mistake had humbled him, yes, but it also offered an opportunity. He didn't yet fully understand the magnitude of what lay ahead, but he knew this. The incident that had begun as his worst nightmare might very well become the turning point of his career. Because sometimes the hardest lessons are taught not by victory or accolades, but by a single unexpected mistake and by a teacher who refuses to let arrogance go unchallenged. Dalton exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders in waves. Tomorrow, the deck would be alive with drills, commands, and challenges once again. But he would face them differently. He would see, he would listen, and he would respect what he had once dismissed. The USS Freedom rolled gently on the waves, indifferent to human drama, yet somehow aligned with the lessons it had just witnessed. For Dalton, the fallout had only begun, but so had the transformation. The USS Freedom hummed with quiet precision as the crew resumed their duties. Dalton moved across the deck, still tense from the previous week's events. Every glance from Admiral Evelyn Ross seemed to pierce through him, silently analyzing his decisions, his posture, even the tone of his voice. He realized he was under constant observation, though she never said so aloud. It was as if the ship itself had become an extension of her will, a classroom where every mistake could teach a life-altering lesson. Ross had not relented on her supervision. Each drill, each operation, each routine maneuver was now a test, not just of skill, but of character. She never raised her voice, never shouted commands like Dalton was used to. Instead, she moved among the crew with quiet authority, correcting mistakes subtly, guiding decisions with a single pointed question or an almost imperceptible gesture. Dalton began to understand that her leadership was not about force or intimidation. It was about control, awareness, and respect. Dalton's first real test came during a navigation drill. A simulated threat appeared on the radar in an approaching vessel that could have represented pirates or hostile forces. Dalton immediately began issuing commands, relying on instinct and the rapid-fire style he had perfected over years of deployments. Ross watched silently, her eyes tracking every movement, every word. Just as he prepared to order the crew to fire simulated countermeasures, she leaned slightly, whispering, "Wait. Reassess the vector. Consider alternative outcomes." Dalton paused, heart racing. His instincts screamed to act decisively, to maintain control, as he always had. But something in Ross's calm, unwavering presence forced him to hesitate. Slowly, he recalculated the scenario, weighing possibilities he would have otherwise ignored. The vessel's trajectory shifted, and by following her guidance, the simulated engagement concluded without incident. "That's better," Ross said quietly, almost conversationally, yet the praise carried the weight of a command. Leadership is anticipation, not reaction. Always think 3 steps ahead. Dalton realized he had begun to see patterns he had previously overlooked. Ross was not merely supervising. She was training him to become a leader who calculated, who observed, who respected both his crew and the gravity of every decision. Each drill became a puzzle, each command a test of discipline and humility. In the following days, Ross introduced more complex challenges. She staged emergency drills that simulated engine failures, fires, and hostile boardings. Dalton found himself exhausted, not just physically but mentally. Each scenario demanded strategic thinking, collaboration, and adaptability. Unlike the straightforward drills he was used to, these required patience, reflection, and most importantly, humility. During one particularly grueling exercise, Dalton oversaw a team tasked with extinguishing a simulated fire in the engine room, while simultaneously maintaining shipboard communication. He barked commands as the team scrambled, expecting Ross to intervene at the first sign of chaos. But she observed silently, letting mistakes unfold and consequences become clear. A misstep in his instructions caused simulated water damage to critical systems. Dalton froze, ready to take the blame immediately, expecting scolding or reprimand. Instead, Ross approached calmly, kneeling beside a crew member and pointing out the error with a quiet voice. "Notice how the system responds when orders aren't clear. Adjust, adapt, and guide, rather than dictate." Dalton watched her, realization dawning. This was more than a drill. It was a lesson in leadership, in patience, in understanding that authority alone could not solve problems. Respect had to be earned, and Dalton had been given the rare opportunity to see how. As the days passed, Dalton's perspective began to shift. He started to recognize the subtle ways Ross communicated through presence, observation, and the careful timing of her words. She never humiliated him, never sought revenge for the elbow. Instead, she demanded excellence, quietly pushing him to grow beyond the limitations of ego. Dalton's old methods, force, speed, decisiveness, were insufficient in this environment. One evening, after another exhausting drill, Dalton found himself walking the deck alone. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold, reflecting off the steel of the ship. He paused, leaning on the railing, and thought about Ross. For the first time, he understood the magnitude of her achievements, the battles she had fought to rise through the ranks, the countless obstacles she had overcome in a world that often resisted her presence. He realized she had faced adversity far greater than his own career challenges and had emerged stronger, wiser, and unshakably composed. Dalton began to question his own assumptions. He had always believed leadership was about dominance, about commanding fear and obedience. Now he saw that true leadership required something entirely different: awareness, empathy, and the ability to inspire others to follow willingly. Ross embodied that philosophy effortlessly, and Dalton, once confident in his superiority, found himself humbled by her quiet authority. The crew noticed the change as well. Dalton, once brash and overbearing, began listening more, consulting others before issuing commands, and even deferring to Ross's judgment when he recognized her insight was superior. They whispered about the transformation, some with admiration, others with disbelief. Dalton's humiliation had become a catalyst, not for resentment, but for growth. Ross, ever observant, recognized the shift. She never praised him openly, never offered false encouragement. Instead, she continued to challenge him, raising the stakes, testing his judgment under pressure. Every drill, every operation, every decision became a lesson, and Dalton absorbed them all, slowly shedding arrogance for awareness, impulsiveness for strategy, and fear of failure for disciplined confidence. The pivotal moment came during a simulated combat scenario at night. Dalton and Ross were tasked with leading a joint team to repel a surprise enemy boarding while maintaining critical systems on the ship. Dalton's instincts screamed for aggressive action, but Ross's calm guidance forced him to analyze the situation differently. He coordinated the team with precision, anticipating threats and mitigating risks before they occurred. By the end of the simulation, Dalton realized he had executed the drill flawlessly, not by force, not by ego, but by applying the lessons Ross had been teaching him all along. He looked at her, expecting approval, a nod, or even a subtle acknowledgement. Ross simply met his gaze with that familiar calm intensity, her eyes almost piercing through him, as if silently declaring, "You are learning." For Dalton, it was a revelation. He finally understood the depth of the lesson the elbow had inadvertently set in motion. It wasn't just about a single moment of carelessness. It was about the entire trajectory of leadership, the ability to see beyond oneself, to guide without dominating, and to earn respect rather than demand it. As the USS Freedom sailed into the night, Dalton stood on the deck, the wind tugging at his uniform, the ocean stretching endlessly before him. He reflected on the past weeks, the humiliation, the trials, the lessons, and felt a profound sense of transformation. Ross had taught him that true command was not a matter of rank or force. It was a matter of presence, wisdom, and the courage to grow beyond one's own limitations. And for the first time in his life, Dalton embraced the notion that being a commander was not about being untouchable. It was about being accountable, aware, and most importantly, capable of leading with both strength and humility. He didn't yet know what challenges lay ahead, but he felt ready, in a way he never had before. And somewhere, deep inside, a flicker of gratitude emerged, gratitude for the woman who had turned a single, reckless mistake into the most profound lesson of his life. The unseen test had begun, and Dalton was finally learning to rise to it. The dawn broke over the Pacific, painting the horizon in streaks of pink and gold. The USS Freedom cut through the restless waves, its massive hull glinting under the morning sun. Normally, the early hours brought routine drills, maintenance checks, and the quiet hum of anticipation. But this morning was different. The intercom crackled, and the commanding officer's voice carried through the ship with urgent authority. "Attention all personnel. An American submarine, the USS Vanguard, has gone silent near the Philippine Sea. All hands report to stations. This is a real emergency." Dalton's stomach tightened. Unlike drills, this was no simulation. The risk was real, and the stakes were impossibly high. Sailors scrambled, preparing emergency gear, coordinating communications, and bracing for rapid deployment. Dalton found himself suddenly aware of the weight of responsibility he carried, not just as a commander, but as a human being responsible for lives hanging in the balance. Ross appeared on deck moments later, calm as ever, her presence commanding the crew with effortless authority. She moved quickly to the operations room, gesturing for Dalton to follow. "You'll coordinate the rescue operations," she said, her tone measured, unwavering. Dalton hesitated for a fraction of a second, taken aback. He had expected to support, to assist. But she was placing the burden of action squarely on his shoulders. "Yes, Admiral," he said, the words tasting strange on his tongue, both a reminder of his humiliation and of the trust now placed in him. The operations room was a whirlwind of activity. Screens displayed sonar readings, maps, and ship positions. Communications officers relayed scattered reports from nearby vessels. Dalton felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, tempered this time with a newfound clarity. He recalled Ross's lessons: observe, calculate, anticipate, respect the crew. Every decision mattered. Ross stood beside him, silent yet present. Dalton glanced at her, searching for guidance, only to find her eyes calm, unwavering. It was a reminder that she trusted him fully, completely, but that trust came with responsibility. He inhaled deeply, letting the calm settle in his chest, and began issuing precise commands. "Engineering team, prepare emergency propulsion adjustments," he called out. "Communications, coordinate with the nearest support vessels. Medical team, ready trauma kits and triage stations. Navigation, chart the fastest safe course. We have a submarine in distress, and we bring her crew home." The ship surged forward, waves crashing against the bow. Dalton moved like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of coordinated action, all while Ross observed silently. Her presence was grounding, but she never interfered. Every decision, every order, every command was Dalton's to bear. Hours passed. The crew worked tirelessly, relaying sonar pings, triangulating positions, and managing logistics. Dalton's mind raced with calculations, depths, pressures, oxygen levels. Every second mattered. Ross occasionally offered a quiet prompt, a question here, a subtle adjustment there, but otherwise remained a steady force of observation. Dalton began to realize the brilliance of her approach. She didn't lead by micromanaging. She led by making him accountable for his choices. Finally, a breakthrough. The sonar team detected a faint signal from the USS Vanguard. Dalton coordinated with nearby support ships, instructing them to move into position while maintaining safety protocols. Every action required precision. Every misstep could cost lives. The tension on the deck was palpable. Crew members held their breath, watching the operations screens with wide, anxious eyes. Dalton's hands moved quickly, decisively, yet carefully. Prepare diving teams. Check oxygen lines. Monitor pressure gauges. We'll need exact coordination for extraction. Lives depend on it, he instructed, his voice calm but firm. Ross nodded slightly, a rare acknowledgement of his growing capability. The rescue teams were deployed, maneuvering toward the compromised submarine. Dalton's eyes never left the screens, calculating currents, tracking depth, and predicting potential hazards. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, but the lessons Ross had instilled weeks ago now guided him. He moved with patience, strategy, and respect for both the crew and the unseen dangers beneath the surface. As the divers descended into the dark, frigid water, Dalton's mind focused entirely on coordination and contingencies. Ross watched silently from the operations room, occasionally offering quiet corrections, always measured, never overbearing. Dalton realized he was no longer acting out of ego or pride. Every order, every decision was calculated to maximize efficiency and protect lives. Hours dragged on. The USS Vanguard's crew had managed to survive in isolated compartments, but oxygen was running low, and the threat of flooding was constant. Dalton coordinated the extraction with painstaking attention, ensuring that each diver, each sailor, each victim was accounted for. Time was the enemy, and the ocean was an unpredictable adversary. Finally, the rescue teams reached the submarine. Dalton's instructions, guided by Ross's subtle mentorship, allowed divers to breach compartments safely, retrieve the crew, and bring them to the surface. Each extraction was tense, fraught with danger, but executed flawlessly. Dalton's mind remained laser-focused, channeling every ounce of training, every lesson from Ross, and every hard-earned experience from years at sea. When the last of the USS Vanguard's crew emerged from the depths, Dalton felt a surge of relief, tempered by exhaustion. He glanced at Ross, expecting approval, acknowledgement, perhaps even a word of praise. She met his gaze calmly, eyes steady, her expression unreadable, but her presence commanding. In that silence, Dalton understood the depth of the transformation he had undergone. He had led not with arrogance or fear, but with clarity, respect, and calculated courage. The ship returned to routine operations, but the atmosphere was electric with the accomplishment. The crew whispered among themselves, marveling at Dalton's leadership and the efficiency of the rescue. Ross, however, remained composed, her focus already shifting to the next detail, the next challenge. Dalton realized that for her, success was not about accolades or recognition. It was about competence, precision, and the lives saved. That evening, Dalton stood alone on the deck, watching the sun sink into the Pacific, casting the ship in golden light. Waves crashed against the hull with a steady rhythm, echoing the pulse of the day's tension. He reflected on the events. The initial mistake, the relentless lessons, the ultimate responsibility of command. Ross had placed him in a crucible, testing not just his skills, but his character. And he had emerged, tempered by pressure, humbled, yet stronger. Dalton knew that this mission would be remembered, not just for its danger or success, but for the lesson it had imparted. Leadership, he now understood, was not about ego or force. It was about observation, calculation, humility, and respect. The elbow on the deck had been the spark. The rescue mission had forged the transformation. And somewhere deep inside, Dalton felt a growing understanding that he was no longer the same commander who had arrived on the USS Freedom weeks ago. He had faced real danger, real responsibility, and had survived not just physically, but morally and emotionally. Ross had tested him, shaped him, and ultimately allowed him to see the true meaning of leadership. The ocean stretched endlessly. Before him, reflecting the fading sunlight, a silent witness to the lessons learned, the lives saved, and the transformation of a commander who had once been blinded by arrogance. Dalton exhaled slowly, letting the exhaustion and relief wash over him. Tomorrow, the drills would resume, the ship would sail on, and the challenges would continue. But he now knew one immutable truth. Leadership demanded more than strength or skill. It demanded awareness, humility, and the courage to grow beyond oneself. As the USS Freedom sailed into the horizon, Dalton stood on the deck, resolute. The mission had tested him in ways he could never have anticipated, and he had emerged stronger, wiser, and profoundly changed. The unseen test had become real, and he had passed not just as a commander, but as a man who understood what it meant to lead. The USS Freedom rocked gently against the waves, but beneath the calm surface, tension rippled through every officer and sailor. The rescue mission for the USS Vanguard was over in name, but Dalton knew the hardest part was just beginning. Some of the submarine's crew were trapped in compartments that could only be accessed through deep dives in a dangerously compromised section of the vessel. Oxygen levels were critically low, flooding threatened structural collapse, and the clock was unforgiving. Every moment was a fight against death itself. Dalton prepared the diving teams personally, checking their oxygen lines, coordinating with the medical officers, and briefing the sailors on the risks. His mind raced with calculations: depth, pressure, current flow, potential debris. He had led countless missions before, but never one where the stakes were this immediate and precise. Every misstep could cost lives, his, theirs, and those of the trapped crew. Ross stood nearby, her presence steady, unwavering, commanding respect without raising her voice. She inspected the gear silently, her calm demeanor infusing a sense of assurance across the deck. Dalton glanced at her, still incredulous at how much he had come to rely on her judgment in such a short time. Weeks ago, the thought of following orders from the woman he had elbowed in a drill would have been unthinkable. Now, he found himself trusting her implicitly. The diving teams descended into the dark, icy water. Dalton followed close behind, his own suit heavy, movements deliberate, senses sharpened by tension. The water pressed against him like an invisible wall, the dim light filtering from above barely penetrating the abyss. Sonar pulses guided them toward the trapped compartments, but every shadow seemed to twist into danger. Dalton's heart pounded, not with fear, but with focused adrenaline. Lives were in his hands. Suddenly, the first trapped crew member appeared, clinging to a support beam. Dalton guided the divers, helping them secure the sailor, ensuring oxygen levels and physical safety. The crew moved efficiently under his commands, a seamless combination of trust and training, the lessons Ross had drilled into him evident in every calculated order. The first extraction was a success, and Dalton allowed himself a fleeting sense of relief. But the mission was far from over. Then, disaster struck. A section of the submarine's interior shifted unexpectedly. Debris collapsed from the ceiling, and Ross, following closely behind Dalton, was caught off guard. She lost her footing in the water, oxygen lines snagged on a protruding pipe, and for a terrifying moment, she was vulnerable. Dalton's instincts surged, honed by Ross's lessons, and without hesitation, he pushed forward. He cut the line and pulled her toward safety with every ounce of strength he possessed. They surfaced together, gasping for air, water streaming from their suits, hearts racing. For a moment, the ocean seemed endless, indifferent, unforgiving. Dalton's mind spun not from exertion, but from the realization of how close they had come to disaster. Ross, however, remained composed, brushing water from her face, her gaze calm yet piercing. "Next time," she said, almost teasingly, "don't forget who's teaching you the ropes." Dalton swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. This mission, unlike any drill, had stripped away ego, revealing raw truth. Ross's courage was not performative. It was instinctive, unwavering, and deeply informed by decades of experience. He realized that the lessons she had imparted through simulated drills were now being cemented in the crucible of real danger. The extraction continued. Dalton moved with newfound precision, coordinating each diver, each trapped sailor, each movement with meticulous care. Every command he issued was deliberate, every decision a calculated step toward safety. Ross observed, occasionally offering subtle guidance, a nod here, a quiet suggestion there, never overtaking, never diminishing his authority. Dalton began to understand the genius of her leadership. She built trust through empowerment, not intimidation. Hours stretched into an exhausting ordeal. The divers worked tirelessly, guided by Dalton's measured commands. Trapped crew members were pulled to safety one by one, each rescue demanding skill, patience, and nerves of steel. Dalton felt exhaustion claw at his body, but Ross's steady presence reminded him that focus, not fatigue, determined survival. He pushed himself forward, aware that hesitation could be fatal. The final compartment remained. Oxygen levels were perilously low, and the structure's integrity was compromised. Dalton instructed the lead diver on positioning and support. He guided each movement, constantly monitoring environmental conditions, adjusting for currents, pressure, and debris. Ross remained at his side, calm, ready to intervene if needed, but trusting Dalton's judgment. When the last trapped sailor emerged, Dalton exhaled in relief. The crew had been saved. Lives were secured, thanks to coordination, calculation, and leadership tempered by lessons learned under Ross's guidance. He looked at her, expecting acknowledgement, approval, something to confirm that he had passed this trial. Ross's eyes met his, and for the first time, Dalton saw subtle pride. Not in a congratulatory sense, but in recognition that he had absorbed and applied her lessons under the harshest possible conditions. The ship's deck was silent for a moment as the exhausted team surfaced. Dalton, soaked, shivering, and utterly drained, stood beside Ross. "You've changed," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon. "You didn't panic. You adapted. You led." Her words were simple, yet carried a weight that eclipsed any praise he had ever received. Dalton felt something shift inside him, a deep, resonant acknowledgement that he had transformed, not just as a commander, but as a human being. That night, the USS Freedom sailed into calmer waters. Dalton stood at the rail, watching the waves glitter under the moonlight. The crew, quietly recuperating from the ordeal, murmured among themselves about the skill and leadership that had saved lives. But Dalton knew the true credit lay not just in his decisions, but in the lessons Ross had imparted, the discipline, the patience, the awareness, the humility that had transformed him from a proud, impulsive commander into a deliberate and thoughtful leader. Ross appeared beside him, her presence calm and commanding as always. "You've learned something invaluable today," she said. "Not about drills, not about strategy. About responsibility, about awareness, about the weight of command. Never forget it." Dalton nodded, understanding that this lesson would stay with him far longer than any medal or commendation. The events of the day had left Dalton changed, forged in a crucible of pressure, fear, and life or death stakes. He no longer viewed leadership as a display of power, but as a mantle of responsibility, tempered by respect for those under his command. The elbow, the humiliation, the drills, they had all led to this moment. And as he looked at Ross, he knew the true test was not over. It was only evolving, stretching into every future challenge he would face. For Dalton, the deep waters of the Pacific were no longer just a setting for strategy. They were a mirror of life itself, unforgiving and demanding courage, foresight, and unwavering resolve. And Admiral Evelyn Ross, the woman he had once elbowed in careless arrogance, had become the guiding force that ensured he would never navigate them or life blindly again. As the USS Freedom sailed on, Dalton felt the weight of responsibility settle firmly on his shoulders, tempered by the knowledge that true leadership demanded more than skill or experience. It demanded character, humility, and the courage to rise under the most extreme circumstances. The ocean stretched endlessly, a silent witness to the transformation of a man who had entered as a proud, arrogant commander and emerged as a thoughtful, deliberate, and capable leader. And Ross, ever vigilant, ever calm, remained at his side, the teacher who had guided him through the depths, both literal and metaphorical, of the most harrowing mission of his career. Back aboard the USS Freedom, the atmosphere was a mixture of relief, fatigue, and quiet celebration. The rescue of the USS Vanguard's crew had been completed with precision and bravery. but the emotional weight of the mission lingered like a tide beneath the surface. Dalton walked through the ship, observing sailors tending to their equipment, exchanging whispered congratulations, and carefully debriefing each other. Every face told a story of tension relieved, of survival earned through courage and teamwork. Dalton's own steps were heavy with exhaustion. He had spent hours under extreme pressure, orchestrating complex maneuvers, and now the adrenaline faded, leaving his body tired, but his mind buzzing with reflection. He recalled Ross's words from the last dive. Not about drills, not about strategy. About responsibility, awareness, the weight of command. Each word resonated in him now with profound clarity. The crew, aware of Dalton's pivotal role in the mission, had begun to treat him with a mixture of respect and awe. Yet Dalton himself felt conflicted. He knew that without Ross, the mission might not have been a success. Every decision he had made, every strategy he had implemented, was filtered through the lessons she had drilled into him, shaping him into a leader capable of navigating chaos with clarity. Ross summoned Dalton to her office. The door opened to reveal her calm, composed presence. She gestured for him to sit, her expression unreadable. "Commander," she began, voice steady and authoritative. This was not a drill. Every decision, every order, every command could have meant life or death. "You've faced real danger today, and you've risen to it?" Dalton swallowed, his pride warred with humility. I couldn't have done it without your guidance, Admiral," he admitted, the words strange but sincere. He had spent years relying on instinct, force, and ego. But now, he realized that leadership was more than a display of strength. It was responsibility, calculation, and respect for the people you lead. Ross's gaze softened, though her authority never wavered. "Acknowledging your mistakes and learning from them is far more courageous than acting with blind confidence," she said. "You've learned that today." Dalton nodded, feeling a sense of redemption settle over him. The humiliation of the elbow, the constant drills, and the relentless supervision had all culminated in this moment. He had been tested in every possible way and emerged stronger, wiser, and profoundly changed. The next few days were filled with ceremonies and debriefings. Reporters had gathered to cover the rescue, but Dalton did not seek the spotlight. Instead, he deferred credit to Ross at every opportunity. "She led this mission," he told them repeatedly. "I simply followed her guidance and coordinated the team." The public response was immediate. Stories hailed the mission as a triumph of leadership, teamwork, and courage. Yet Dalton knew the real victory lay not in accolades, but in personal growth. Ross observed quietly as Dalton navigated the recognition. She had seen many commanders bask in glory while failing to internalize the lessons of their experiences. Dalton, however, displayed an unusual humility and awareness. He did not seek praise. He sought to learn and to honor the people whose lives depended on his decisions. Later, Dalton returned to the deck, alone, staring at the endless horizon. The ocean stretched before him, dark and serene, reflecting the quiet glow of the setting sun. He thought about the journey he had taken from the arrogance that had led to the elbow, to the rigorous drills that humbled him, to the real-life mission that tested every lesson Ross had imparted. He realized that true leadership required more than skill or rank. It demanded integrity, awareness, and a willingness to accept guidance, even from those once underestimated. Ross joined him silently, her presence a comforting constant. "You've changed, Commander," she said softly, her eyes scanning the horizon alongside his. "Not everyone can face their mistakes and emerge better for it. Most crumble, most blame others. You didn't?" Dalton felt a surge of gratitude, mixed with the residual pride of accomplishment. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. Ross smiled faintly, a rare, subtle expression that carried more weight than any formal commendation. "You did it, Commander," Not me. I guided you, yes, but you executed. That is what matters. Her words reinforced a critical truth Dalton had begun to internalize. Leadership was not about control, but about empowerment, responsibility, and accountability. The weeks following the mission were a period of reflection and consolidation. Dalton implemented the lessons he had learned under Ross's supervision, reshaping his leadership style. He began actively mentoring junior officers, encouraging calculated decision-making, humility, and teamwork. His relationship with the crew transformed. Respect replaced fear. Trust replaced tension. Sailors approached him willingly, confident in his guidance, knowing he had earned it not through rank, but through action and integrity. During one particularly quiet evening, Dalton visited Ross in her office once more. "Admiral," he said, "I want to formally acknowledge everything you've taught me. Not just strategy, but the essence of leadership itself. I've been arrogant for too long. I see now that leadership is not about dominance. It's about responsibility, awareness, and the people you serve." Ross regarded him calmly. "Redemption is not about recognition, Commander. It is about transformation. You have learned that your strength is measured not by the fear you inspire, but by the lives you protect, the decisions you make, and the example you set. Today, you lead with clarity, courage, and humility." Dalton felt a profound sense of closure, a culmination of lessons that had been years in the making, but crystallized in the crucible of a single harrowing mission. The ship's crew had noticed the change in Dalton as well. Where once he had been distant, proud, and imperious, he now moved among them with purpose tempered by understanding. He listened more, consulted frequently, and valued input from every corner of the deck. The transformation was evident, not just in his actions, but in the morale of the crew. Sailors who had once feared him now respected him, and that respect was earned, lasting, and genuine. Months later, during a small private ceremony aboard the ship, Dalton was formally commended for his role in the USS Vanguard's rescue. Ross pinned the medal to his chest, her expression composed but proud. "You've grown, Commander," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of authority and mentorship. "Continue to lead with this clarity, and you will honor not only yourself, but every sailor under your command." Dalton's chest swelled, but not with ego. It was a chest filled with humility, gratitude, and a deep understanding of responsibility. "I will, Admiral," he replied, voice steady, sincere. "I will not forget what I've learned from you." Later, alone on the deck, Dalton reflected on the journey that had led him here. From the careless elbow that humiliated him, to the relentless supervision and high-pressure drills, to the life-or-death mission that demanded every lesson be applied, he had emerged transformed. Redemption was not a reward handed to him, nor was it a medal pinned to his chest. It was a profound internal shift, a recognition of what it truly meant to lead, protect, and inspire. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, a mirror of his own growth and resilience. He realized that the journey of redemption was ongoing. It would not end with medals, ceremonies, or public recognition. It would continue in every decision, every action, every moment of leadership. And he was ready for it. Admiral Ross approached quietly, her presence grounding him once more. "The real test," she said softly, "is what you do with what you've learned. Will you lead as you should, or will old habits creep back in?" Dalton met her gaze, unwavering. "I've learned, Admiral. I've changed. And I will continue to lead the way you've taught me." Ross's eyes softened, a rare flicker of approval and pride. "Good. That is all I ask." Dalton exhaled, feeling the weight of the past weeks settle into a sense of calm determination. Redemption had been earned, not given. He had faced mistakes, challenges, and the harshest of tests, and emerged stronger, wiser, and prepared to carry the mantle of leadership with integrity, humility, and courage. The USS Freedom sailed on, cutting through the waves with steady precision. Dalton, standing on the deck, understood that this mission was more than a rescue. It was a transformation. And the lessons learned under Admiral Ross's guidance would remain with him forever, guiding every decision, every command, and every life he touched in the years to come. The USS Freedom had returned to port, the ship now quiet in the early morning sun. Sailors moved methodically across the deck, performing inspections and maintaining the vessel after weeks at sea. For Dalton, the ship felt different now. Every creak, every rope, every hatch seemed infused with significance. He moved among the crew, no longer just as a commander, but as a leader who had earned respect through action, humility, and resilience. The ceremony was scheduled for the mid-morning. It was to honor the heroic efforts during the USS Vanguard rescue operation, a mission that had tested every ounce of skill, nerve, and leadership among the crew. Flags fluttered in the crisp sea breeze, officers stood at attention, and the air was charged with anticipation. Families of sailors, dignitaries, and Navy officials gathered, their eyes bright with pride and admiration. Dalton walked toward the ceremonial area with measured steps. He felt a quiet tension in his chest, not anxiety, but the awareness of responsibility. Every medal pinned, every word spoken would carry weight, a reflection not only of the mission, but of the leadership that had guided it. Beside him, Admiral Ross moved with her characteristic composure. Dalton glanced at her, a surge of gratitude welling up. She had shaped him, challenged him, and now stood beside him as he stepped into public recognition. The commanding officer approached the podium. Today, we honor the crew of the USS Freedom for their bravery, skill, and leadership in the successful rescue of the USS Vanguard's crew, he announced. The gathered crowd applauded, the sound rolling across the deck and echoing against the hull. Dalton's eyes scanned the faces of the sailors, some he had trained, some he had led, some he had witnessed rising to extraordinary courage in the moments of crisis. Their resilience, their dedication, their lives were now intertwined with his own journey. One by one, crew members received medals, commendations, and certificates of recognition. Dalton's mind wandered briefly to the days leading up to this moment. The elbow that had humiliated him, Ross's relentless guidance, the real danger of the rescue mission, and the transformation that had occurred under the most extreme circumstances. Each step had led to this moment, each lesson culminating in redemption, courage, and public acknowledgement. Finally, Dalton's name was called. He stepped forward, chest straight, shoulders back, heart steady. Ross followed, standing behind him, an unspoken acknowledgement of the growth she had fostered. The commanding officer approached, holding a folded medal. "Commander Dalton," he said, voice resonant, "for exemplary leadership, courage under pressure, and extraordinary service, we present you with the Navy Cross." Dalton felt the medal in his hands, its weight grounding him in a mixture of pride, humility, and reflection. He had earned it, yes, but he knew the true victory lay not in the medal, but in the transformation it symbolized. The crowd erupted in applause, yet Dalton's gaze remained fixed on Ross. Her eyes met his, calm, steady, and subtly proud. It was approval without words, acknowledgement without fanfare. The ceremony continued with speeches and recognition for the crew, but Dalton's mind wandered through the journey that had brought him here. He remembered the moment of the elbow, the humiliation, the endless drills, the intense supervision, the near-death dives into the depths, and the life-or-death decisions during the mission. Each memory was vivid, a tapestry of struggle, growth, and ultimately, redemption. As the applause subsided, Ross stepped forward, addressing the crowd. Her voice was calm yet commanding, resonating with authority and respect. Leadership is tested not by routine, not by medals, not by titles. It is tested in moments of crisis, in decisions that determine life or death, and in the ability to rise beyond ego and fear. Commander Dalton exemplifies these qualities. He has grown, adapted, and led with clarity, courage, and humility. Dalton felt a deep sense of gratitude, but also an understanding that this acknowledgement was a milestone, not a conclusion. Leadership, he now realized, was not static. It was a constant, evolving responsibility. Every decision, every mission, every interaction would be shaped by the lessons learned under Ross's guidance. After the formal ceremony, Dalton mingled with the crew, shaking hands, sharing quiet words of encouragement, and listening to their experiences. He understood that leadership was not just about commands and medals. It was about connection, trust, and empowerment. The sailors looked at him differently, now not just as a commander, but as someone who had shared the burden, faced danger alongside them, and emerged with integrity intact. Later, in a private moment on the deck, Dalton approached Ross. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, reflecting the fading sunlight. "Thank you," he said quietly, voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For teaching me, guiding me, challenging me." Ross regarded him calmly, a subtle softness in her eyes. "You did the work, Commander." "I guided, yes, but the execution, the courage, the leadership, it was yours. Remember that." Dalton nodded, feeling the depth of her words. They were not just praise, they were confirmation that he had internalized the lessons, that he had transformed not by external validation, but by action, reflection, and growth. The crew gathered one last time on the deck, sharing stories, laughter, and moments of camaraderie. Dalton observed them, understanding that the bonds forged in adversity were far stronger than any medal or commendation. Leadership was not about hierarchy. It was about trust, resilience, and shared purpose. The ceremony had celebrated heroism, yes, but the true victory was in the transformation of character, of relationships, of understanding what it meant to lead with integrity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the deck in warm golden light, Dalton felt a profound sense of closure. The journey from the initial elbow, an act of careless arrogance, to this moment of recognition had been arduous, humbling, and transformative. He had faced his flaws, confronted danger, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable. Ross stood beside him, her presence a constant reminder of the journey and the lessons learned. "The ceremony ends today," she said softly, "but your work continues. Leadership is not a medal, it is a lifelong commitment. Carry these lessons forward, and you will honor those who trust you with their lives." Dalton nodded, understanding that the real measure of redemption was not in the ceremony, but in how he would lead every day going forward. That night, as the USS Freedom prepared for departure, Dalton stood at the rail, gazing at the endless horizon. He reflected on the weeks of challenge, the trials that had tested his ego, skill, and character, and the ultimate redemption that had been earned through courage, humility, and guidance. The ocean, vast and eternal, mirrored the endless possibilities of leadership and the profound responsibility it entailed. Dalton knew that the journey was far from over. New missions, challenges, and decisions awaited. But he now faced them with clarity, strength tempered by humility, and a deep understanding of what true leadership meant. The ceremony had celebrated achievement, but the lessons, the transformation, and the redemption would guide him through every challenge yet to come. As the stars began to shimmer over the Pacific, Dalton felt a quiet resolve settle within him. He had faced mistakes, danger, and the harshest tests of leadership, and had emerged transformed. The medal on his chest was a symbol, but the real reward was the person he had become, a commander capable of leading with courage, clarity, and compassion. The USS Freedom sailed onward into the night, carrying its crew, its lessons, and its evolving legacy. Dalton, standing at the helm of his own transformation, understood that true leadership was not measured by victories alone, but by the courage to face one's flaws, the humility to learn, and the wisdom to guide others through both calm and storm. The USS Freedom glided steadily across the ocean, the sun rising in a brilliant blaze over the horizon. The ship had returned from a mission that would be remembered in Navy history. Yet its crew now faced the quieter moments, the time for reflection, growth, and understanding the lessons embedded in every challenge they had endured. For Dalton, these moments were more profound than any medal or ceremony. He had been tested in every conceivable way and had emerged changed, tempered by adversity and guided by the steady hand of Admiral Evelyn Ross. Dalton walked the deck, observing the crew as they went about their duties. There was a new energy among them, a confidence born not just of surviving the rescue mission, but of witnessing leadership transformed. Dalton's presence now inspired trust rather than fear. Sailors approached him with questions, insights, and concerns, knowing he would listen carefully and act thoughtfully. His leadership had become more than commands and directives. It was a living, evolving connection with every person aboard the ship. He paused at the railing, looking out over the endless expanse of water. The ocean was both beautiful and unforgiving, a perfect metaphor for leadership itself. Dalton reflected on the journey that had led him here, the careless elbow that had begun it all, the relentless drills that had stripped him of arrogance, the life-or-death mission that had forced him to apply every lesson he had learned. Each event had been a stepping stone, each challenge a crucible that forged his character. Ross appeared beside him, her presence as calm and commanding as ever. She did not speak immediately, letting Dalton absorb the weight of the moment. Finally, she said, "Leadership is not about the victories you achieve or the medals you earn. It's about the lives you impact, the trust you build, and the example you set. You've done that well, Commander." Dalton nodded, feeling the full significance of her words. He realized that the medal he had received was not the measure of his growth. The true measure lay in the transformation of himself and those around him. He had learned humility, patience, and the subtle art of guiding others without dominating them. He had learned to anticipate, to respect, and to inspire. Over the following weeks, Dalton took active steps to apply these lessons. He mentored junior officers, encouraging them to make thoughtful decisions, to communicate clearly, and to value the perspectives of those around them. He emphasized teamwork, ensuring that every sailor understood their importance and potential impact. The culture aboard the USS Freedom shifted, not through strict enforcement, but through example, empathy, and consistent demonstration of integrity. Ross observed these changes with quiet satisfaction. She had guided Dalton through the trials, but now he was fully applying the principles he had learned. He had moved from being an impulsive, prideful commander to a thoughtful, deliberate, and inspiring leader. The shift was profound, not only for Dalton, but for the entire crew. They now operated with heightened awareness, trust, and cohesion, ready to face any challenge together. One afternoon, Dalton was called to the communications room. A routine training exercise was underway, but this one was different. It simulated a complex, multi-vessel crisis. Dalton coordinated the operation with precision, using every skill he had honed under Ross's mentorship. He delegated responsibilities effectively, listened to input, and adapted to unexpected developments in real time. The exercise was a success, and the crew's efficiency and coordination reflected the profound changes in their leadership. As the exercise concluded, Ross approached him quietly. "You've internalized the lessons, Commander. Not just the technical skills, but the essence of leadership itself. That is your true legacy." Dalton looked at her, understanding that her mentorship had been the catalyst for everything he had achieved. He had been humbled, tested, and guided, and now he was ready to lead independently, with wisdom and confidence. In the weeks that followed, Dalton began documenting the principles he had learned, creating a guide for future officers. He wanted to ensure that the lessons of humility, awareness, responsibility, and empowerment would continue to shape leaders long after he was gone. It was his way of giving back, of honoring Ross's guidance, and of ensuring that the values he had embraced became part of the enduring culture aboard the ship. The USS Freedom sailed into foreign waters, engaged in joint exercises with allied nations. Dalton's reputation as a capable and thoughtful leader spread, earning respect not through intimidation, but through demonstrated competence, integrity, and the ability to inspire those under his command. He had learned that true leadership was not about personal glory, but about the growth, safety, and morale of the entire crew. Years later, Dalton would reflect on this period of his career as the turning point. The moment that began with a reckless mistake, the elbow, had transformed into a journey of redemption, growth, and mastery of leadership. He had been tested under the most extreme conditions, faced real danger, and emerged stronger, wiser, and deeply aware of his responsibilities. The lessons of Ross's mentorship remained with him, guiding every decision and interaction, shaping the legacy he would leave behind. During a quiet evening on deck, Dalton watched new recruits train with precision and focus. He saw echoes of his younger self, the pride, the impulsiveness, the eagerness, but he also saw the potential for transformation. He approached the recruits, sharing lessons learned, not through commands or discipline, but through storytelling and example. His words resonated with the young officers, planting seeds of awareness, humility, and courage. Ross joined him silently, observing the scene with calm satisfaction. "The future is in good hands," she said softly. Dalton nodded, understanding that his true role had evolved. He was no longer just a commander, but a mentor, a guide, and a living example of the principles Ross had instilled in him. As the sun set over the Pacific, casting a golden glow across the deck, Dalton reflected on the journey he had traveled. The USS Freedom had been more than a vessel. It had been a crucible, a classroom, and a proving ground. Ross's mentorship had shaped him into a leader capable of facing any challenge, guiding others with integrity, and leaving a legacy that would endure long after his own service. The legacy of leadership, Dalton realized, was not about medals or ceremonies. It was about the impact on others, the lessons passed forward, and the courage to face mistakes, learn from them, and rise stronger. He had been humbled, tested, and transformed, and now he was ready to ensure that every sailor, every officer, and every leader who followed would benefit from the same guidance, insight, and example. The USS Freedom sailed on, its crew stronger, its leadership wiser, and its legacy secure. Dalton stood at the rail, the wind tugging at his uniform, the ocean stretching endlessly before him. He understood that the true measure of a leader was not in the battles fought or medals earned, but in the lives touched, the lessons shared, and the integrity upheld. Admiral Ross joined him one final time, her presence steady and commanding. "You have learned the most difficult lesson," she said quietly. "Leadership is not a destination, it is a journey. Continue wisely, and your legacy will inspire generations." Dalton nodded, the weight of her words settling deeply into his consciousness. As night fell, the stars shimmered over the vast Pacific, mirroring the endless possibilities and responsibilities that lay ahead. Dalton felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, tempered by the awareness that his journey was ongoing. He had been tested, humbled, and guided, and now he had emerged as the leader he was meant to be. The USS Freedom sailed onward, cutting through the waves with precision, carrying a crew transformed, a commander redeemed, and a legacy of leadership forged in adversity, humility, and courage. Dalton had learned, he had grown, and he had left an indelible mark, not just on the ship or the Navy, but on the very essence of leadership itself. And so, the story concluded not with the accolades, but with the enduring truth. True leadership is measured not by rank or recognition, but by integrity, courage, humility, and the ability to empower others to rise alongside you. Dalton had embraced this truth, and in doing so, he had ensured that the legacy of leadership would continue long after the USS Freedom sailed beyond the horizon.